Now starting with the scene tornado underscore 03, we're going to take a look at some different lighting techniques, and basically going to be using negative lighting to influence the environment and the volumetric environment. So what we want to start with is just a normal spotlight. If you're using Extreme within the host application or within any of the host applications, it's a good idea to choose the view lights for this. And if you need to, go into the standalone just to kind of set this up. Because some of the native light conversions won't work properly, or they're going to just destroy your scene in your host application because of the way the light works. So what we're going to be doing is basically using the power in a negative value. So all you got to do is type in, say, negative 250, and we'll start at negative 600. And in order for this to work properly, we also need to use volumetric lighting. That's because the entire atmosphere is volumetric. So in order to influence the haze and other areas of the scene that are like that, the sky, the decay, all the environment variables, we do need to have something that is also volumetric. So we can turn on volumetric lighting, and you'll start to see in the main camera view just something that's just black. And that's because of the power setting and the way the fall off is set. So if we change the power to, say, negative 250, go back, it's still really strong. The reason for that is the volumetric intensity. So if we edit the volumetric settings, what we can do is adjust between the intensity of the volumetric and the intensity or the power of the light itself. And they do have different influences on different parts of the scene or different parts of the haze or the sky, depending on which is stronger. The higher the volumetric lighting, the more intensity and subtraction to the atmosphere you'll see. They balance out to approximately the same, but for the most part, if you can manage to use your light with a higher intensity for the volumetric, it does work out better. To reduce the intensity, sometimes it's easier to control, sometimes it's harder. It's really more about what's going to be easiest to control as a light. So what I want to do is kind of raise this up above the tornado. And right now we don't have it influencing clouds. If I go ahead and turn on clouds, it's going to darken up the cone and the rest of the layer. What I want to do is adjust the spread of the angle. Just gonna center the view a little more, and then adjust the spread to, say, 40. And then what we can do is start to compensate with the fall off. So we could type in a fall off 150, and then I'll adjust the outer value. And we just want to move it a bit off screen so that the primary intensity is not affecting what we can see. Because it does create that sort of dot in the center or at the start of the light. Now, one way we can remove that is to vary the lighting. So we're going to edit the light, go to lighting, and set a custom value. And we'll go ahead and set this to 1 kilometer for the cutoff distance, and see how that influences the scene. You can just kind of refresh the camera view, making sure auto update is on in order to get reaction and have the preview update and show you whether or not that's enough. Go ahead and bring it to 2 kilometers, and we're going to edit the filter. And we can refresh the scene this way too, while editing the filter. And we want to make sure that right in the beginning, it starts at 0, and that way it won't be overly intense. What we could also do is kind of balance it out, and then we can just adjust the light up and down. And then change the intensity if needed. We could also have something that affects the scene more, raising it up kind of high and starting to use much higher values. And we might need to increase the cutoff distance, so we'll go ahead and take a look at the height. We've got about 3 kilometers. So we can raise that up more. And now we have this filter being this whole region or zone. So we might want to have more intensity. It might be a bit too much, but we can kind of balance that out a little if needed. Or we can change the distance of the cutoff. And I'm just going to compensate by changing the power to -1000. Now, right now we're using a colored light or a non-colored light. We just have white. So it's not taking into account the sunlight color. So if we wanted to start to influence this with a color, we're going to also subtract that color from the scene. So now everything is very blue because we're subtracting a yellow color. So if we want to use blue, we can get something more red. And kind of go towards green, and get something more purple. And then the purple, which is going to be the hardest for us to see with the light, is where the haze will start to take on its own color with the clouds, so we can make things a little more green. By using the light, which is kind of neat. So we don't have to worry about messing around with certain atmosphere values. I'm going to desaturate this. We don't want a whole lot of influence within the color. So you can see by turning it on and off, there's a big difference in the color around just the tornado. We could also set up something that's going to affect the back of the scene without having to use God rays, basically, or volumetric sunlight. It's going to render a lot quicker. And then we have more control over the quality of the render by adjusting the volumetric quality. So we can sort of set up independent quality zones for what needs to be rendered, instead of just applying it to the entire scene, which can be a lot to calculate sometimes. So we could really easily just copy and paste this spotlight. I'm going to reset the color and drag it off towards the back. Take the spread and change it to about 65. And you can still choose whether or not to influence clouds. If you just want to adjust and modify the atmosphere, then you can turn off that cloud influence. And then we can go ahead and rotate. And sort of cover the entire scene. Let me pull that back. Adjust the fall off. which is the intensity towards the center, it does end up behaving more like a point light when it reaches a certain fall off, but we can still limit the zone or the spread, which is what makes it better than using a point light. And you just kind of diffuse it by adjusting the fall off value. Maybe pull this back to the full cloud zone. And we may need to adjust the intensity, the volumetric a little, or the distance. And it looks like that's too much. Of course, our power is at 3,000, so it might be alright if we just increased one aspect rather than both. And so we'll just reduce the power and change the cutoff distance. And then we can start adjusting fall off. And that way it's not so grainy. And we can still darken this entire region. And then we can start filling in more spots if we wanted to with other lights. And you can see a nice variability without having to use more complex render options like God rays and volumetric sunlight, because that can tend to get grainy when you're covering very large areas with it. If your settings aren't perfect, this way you can render with a lower quality. For the settings, get something, well, basically that renders faster without having to turn up a whole bunch of quality settings. So here's just kind of a quick render of it. Only took about a minute. The graininess is not bad at all. And then we can see the different levels of lighting in there. Now, if we use this together with relighting, we get even more power over these individual lights. So I'm going to go ahead and just go to the render options, enable relighting. So this is the outputted render, and it took about 12 minutes because of the relighting. So for stills, that's alright. Animation, you're not going to want to have, you don't want to have relighting turned on, obviously. So what you can do to utilize this for an animation would be to kind of fine-tune settings. So let's say our spotlight is right now at 1, and let's say that equals power of 1,000. So if we were to bring down the spotlight to 0.5, we would just go back into the scene and set the power to half and set it to 500. So you can kind of still use this to fine-tune some of the settings, and then just go back and change the actual lights. Keeping in mind that modifying the ambient and the sunlight intensity is a little more difficult. One thing you could do with the sunlight is if you were to, say, have it at 0.5 and you wanted that to apply to an animation, what you could do is lower the sunlight color and darken it to the equivalent RGB value. So if it was 255 white at sunlight 1, if you bring it down to say 0.5, then you would set to half the RGB value, so about 127. And that's basically midpoint gray. So that'll kind of override the light for animation. And you can kind of do the same thing with the ambient light by modifying the ambient light color within the atmosphere editor in the lighting tab. So there are a lot of ways to transfer this over to animation without having to enable relighting for the different frames. Now we can take a look at the individual lights. We have the first spotlight, which is right above the cone and those layers, and then that second spotlight out towards the back. If we just take a look at that one, we can just see it darkening this area of the sky. So you can also go over your values and adjust the intensity that way to get something a little more striking. It's somewhat difficult to do that, to transfer it over to animation, because increasing the values like that, you can increase the intensity of the sunlight, but to go over for the other ones and have them sort of equalize with the way that the negative value is set up might be difficult. But for stills, this is a cool way to really get something out of an image, to be able to go in and change these lighting values throughout the scene that affect different elements. Now, the base of the tornado is a little boring at the moment. So what we could do to increase the clouds around that area, we could make a lot of changes to the function or add in some new cloud layers. The easiest thing to really do is just to use a meta cloud, and we'll just reduce intensity. We use the dark and rough, and then we can scale that down a bit and just place it where the tornado is. Scale it up. And we'll just need to basically modify the density, maybe change the scale 0.5. We could also add more spheres and more meta cloud objects. Once we have an object selected, we can go over to the left and add a meta cloud primitive, and then we can just move that around within the cloud layer to fill it in. And that'll make things more interesting. And if you have an ecosystem you want to affect, you can also take the omniventilator and put that down at the base, and that'll move around ecosystems. Plants by default, and then if you click the enable ecosystem or icon, it will influence and blow around ecosystems. It does add a lot to the render time, calculating the dynamics of that, but it is a really cool effect, and it doesn't really damage the render times too much. It's still worth using, definitely. And you don't have to use an omni ventilator. You can use a directional ventilator, which is basically set up just like a spotlight, where it has kind of a cone angle to it. And so if you want it to be directional, you can do that too. You can also attach it. Say if we wanted to attach that to the dark and the rough meta cloud. We could just go to the motion tab and we could link it to the cloud. So now as we move the cloud, the ventilator will move with it. Of course, the cloud will also have to be basically somewhat linked to the cone origin, or you can just kind of track them individually for keyframes. But I'm going to go ahead and save this. You can load it in, take a look at it if you want to kind of dissect the scene. It's Tornado 3 lighting. And if at any time you have trouble keeping the negative values within the lights, sometimes View will kind of override a negative value, set it to 0, and even though it's still there and influencing the scene, it'll display as 0. So if at any time you're having trouble using the negative values within the Aspect tab, you can go to the Object Graph, and there's an output for power, and all you need to do is add in a constant node and set the power. If you have any trouble with that not applying, you can add a filter in between, just a standard filter, and that'll usually trigger the constant node to work properly. That's an issue with cloud layer modulation. Controlling these values with constants will not work until you add a filter node. Right now, a height modulation, if I extract that, 1 is not going to do anything. Changing it to 0 won't make any change whatsoever until I add in a filter in between it. Then I can affect all the different layers and settings. Before there was no influence, and now I can pretty much add anything. So you do need to have a filter there. That can sometimes happen. But just using the graph setting, it's pretty nice because we can also publish these values so that anytime we edit the object, a panel will come up with whatever we're controlling. So we could also set up colors in here. We could set up any of the outputs that are available. So now we can adjust the power directly from this window here. That of course works for any object that has a graph.